Okay, I'd like to welcome you in the seventh debate round of the EurOpen 2017 debate tournament. On side proposition, we have Team USA Red. On side opposition, we have Team Glacier. My name is Mihandic, I will be your chair judge today. I'll also have my main judge here with me. I promise my USA debate pen is not showing any affiliation and will not affect my judgment at all. And without any further ado, I'd like to call the first speaker of proposition to open the debate.
While statues of Confederate generals that promoted slavery are just starting to come down in the United States, just months ago the Russian government started putting up more statues of Joseph Stalin, a man who starved, murdered, and oppressed his people. We do not believe in this reality, and we think we should take a stand against immoral actions like this, and that is why we are so proud to propose today's motion. Before I address the first two substantive arguments from side proposition on why it is principally justified to pursue this policy, and second on how it will improve education, with our second speaker introducing our third argument, I would like to clarify a couple of things in this round. We think that to celebrate means to praise an individual and put them in a public light on a relatively public, in a positive light on a relatively public scale. And we think that the actors that are doing the celebrating in this case are states or governments. We also think that nationally important historical figures are those who had a significant impact on a nation's history, and that deeply immoral actions are those that perpetuated systemic oppression and injustice viewed as such on a relatively comprehensive level. Deeply immoral actions such as rape, murder, genocide, and things like this. We think that the opposition has the burden in today's round to prove to us why celebration is justified and is somehow more uniquely beneficial or necessary than other forms of acknowledgement, like education, and it is going to be our burden to prove why this is actually principally and practically wrong or harmful. Now with that, we'll move on to introducing our first substantive argument from side proposition on why principally we choose to condemn rather than celebrate deeply immoral figures. Two layers under this. The first is that these leaders deserve condemnation. We think that the majority of figures that we are talking about in today's round are connected with the suffering and subjugation of large amounts of people. They have stomped on the lives and dignity of individuals, and we believe that at the very least, even beyond condemning these individuals, we should at the very least not celebrate them. We think that a good example of this is someone like Robert E. Lee, a Confederate general in the United States. Yes, when statues celebrate Robert E. Lee, they're ostensibly celebrating his prowess as a military leader, but when you celebrate the individual, you celebrate every single thing that they stood for and did, including Robert E. Lee's championship of slavery, something that dehumanized and subjugated millions of individuals across the United States, dehumanized them, violated their liberty, and often violated their lives. We also think that another harmful thing is that often extremist groups rally around these individuals. For example, in the United States, neo-Nazi groups and alt-right movements rally around people like Robert E. Lee because they are being celebrated in the public eye and use these celebrations of deeply immoral figures as ways to promote their own movements. We think that condemnation, therefore, sparks a conversation surrounding these issues and brings attention to the fact that the government will not stand for such deeply immoral actions as those. We think it is the state's obligation to pursue that and take a stand against these actions. Our second layer under this argument is that in and of itself, this is just an important symbol. As we explained earlier, we think that the state's purpose is to justly fulfill the will of its own people, and it's important for the state to make sure that it is protecting those individuals as well. So, when it is celebrating individuals that have had a direct hand in oppressing its own people, we think that fundamentally violates the very purpose of a government and corrupts their moral responsibility. Instead, by refusing to celebrate these deeply immoral leaders, we uphold the purpose of government. An example of this is, for example, Christopher Columbus in the US, who his actions literally led to the death of 90% of Native Americans in the United States at the time of his arrival. The United States has an obligation to stand against this, not to celebrate it and literally create a national holiday around this individual. Furthermore, we don't think that Russia should celebrate Joseph Stalin, an individual that massacred and starved millions of his own people. We have an obligation to take a stand against this and set that kind of precedent. Our second substantive argument in today's round is on improving education and how refusing to celebrate nationally important historical figures involved in deeply immoral actions is going to do that. Again, two layers under this argument. The first is that we decrease biased portrayals of these individuals. We understand on Team Proposition that oppression is really, really uncomfortable and often dangerous to talk about in a nation, which is why schools often slip up in teaching about wrongs of the past. For example, in the United Kingdom, it was found that 4 out of every 10 British citizens believes that British imperialism was actually really good and something to be proud of. And because their education system celebrated and glossed over all of the atrocities involved in that process, they essentially look past these atrocities and view it as something positive. When in reality, British imperialism enslaved, oppressed, and killed and raped individuals basically because they weren't white, for the economic gain of the British Empire. Celebration of these kinds of events and individuals sanitizes that history, and we think that celebration is almost inevitable in states' classrooms when states are biased in portraying favorably their own history. We don't think that is something we can stand for. I'll take you in a moment. And we think that states should be much more objective and refuse to celebrate these deeply immoral actions. Go.
So it's your contention that if a historically important figure has ever done something deeply immoral, no one should ever celebrate them.
Look, we'd just like to clarify on our side of the house that no, we don't believe we should celebrate the individual because of the negative things that they did. But let's just be clear, if they did something really positive, we're willing to acknowledge that that positive thing happened, educate about the individual in a comprehensive light, but we refuse to glorify that individual in a public setting. We think that education and objective analysis in a textbook that does not celebrate the individual but may recognize positive things that occurred in the past is far different from glorifying them, say, with a national holiday or with a statue and things like that. Those two are very, very different. We don't think that countries should celebrate people like Joseph Stalin or Mao Zedong, who led to, again, the murder and starvation of millions of people. We don't think that Winston Churchill should be celebrated when he led to the famine, intentionally, the famine and mass starvation of the continent of India. We think that glorifying these individuals is just wrong, and that by condemning them, we create awareness, especially among students who are particularly susceptible to bias by the government. And we also think that this creates understanding that by educating about the real history of these individuals and not just celebrating them and glossing over all of these atrocities, we can actually promote understanding, generate sympathy about the atrocities of the past and the existing victims in the present, which actually leads into our second layer of analysis under this argument about how this is going to change policies. We think that this is going to change the association that people have with certain historical figures. People like Winston Churchill, people like Joseph Stalin, and it's going to lead to a dialogue about how we should condemn these horrific actions, and we are going to refuse to deify people who engage in them. This takes a strong stance against actions like this, and we think in the future is going to lead people not to engage in such immoral policies and sacrifice liberties sacrifice morals and liberties because they know that their society has an expectation that that is not going to be accepted. This is incredibly important. On a principle level, the state does act, in a certain sense, as the moral example for its people, and thus when it celebrates individuals involved in deeply immoral actions, often inflicted against its people, that's principally wrong. And when we stand against that, that also leads to better education and a better future, and that's why we're so proud to propose. Thank you.
I thank the first speaker for her fine speech. Now I'd like to invite the first speaker to open the debate for side opposition.
Side Proposition made some excellent arguments in their first speech, talking about why racial bias is bad. And we as Side Opposition completely agree. Racial bias is bad. But through my speech, we're going to be talking about how essentially side proposition doesn't make the problem any better. We'll see that as I respond to the points that they brought up, and then we'll conclude with my own couple of substantives, specifically the first substantive about how we are left under side proposition with completely arbitrary standards. Let's start off with their definitions of celebrate, of essentially an important historical figure, and then of what deeply immoral means. We agree with all of those definitions, just to clarify. Moving on to the first substantive. They basically said these figures, these historical figures, deserve condemnation. They had the example of Robert E. Lee. They said this leads to extremist groups. And the most interesting thing under this point was when the speaker said, we can't celebrate anything about these people. That was one of the quotes from the first speaker on side proposition. My response is, who can we celebrate? If we can't celebrate those people, if we can't celebrate someone who's done something deeply immoral, there's not a lot of options left for society. And I'm going to be talking about the impact of that crucial argument right now, and also a little bit later in my speech. The impact is that society is left with ideals instead of examples. This is crucial. When we take everyone who's fought against racial injustice, against the oppression of the LGBTQ community, against the oppression of minorities. When we take all of those figures and then we say, yeah, those figures did some good things, but because they did some bad things too, we're not going to celebrate them, what is society left with? Society's left with the idea that, yeah, fighting against racial injustice is great, but heck, I can't do it because I mess up all the time. And so it's extremely difficult for people to be essentially incentivized to fight against things like racial injustice and oppression when they're left with the idea of, if I fight for these things, it'll be great, but if I ever mess up, everyone's going to hate me. And that's the end result of Team Proposition's case. And I'll be expounding upon that impact when we move on. Their second layer of analysis under this first substantive was talking about how essentially the statues and things of that nature are a symbol. And my response here is no change in opinion. And I'm going to be expounding upon this additionally. Now I asked a point of information talking about, okay, if these figures are celebrated, what's the end result here? My POI had to deal with, can we celebrate the good things that these figures did? And Team Proposition kind of switched their stance a little bit. Because if you go back to this first layer of analysis, I'll take you in 1 second. If you go back to their first layer of analysis, they basically said, we can't celebrate anything about these people because that means we condone their bad actions. After that POI, they switched, and they said, actually, we can still celebrate the good things, and I'd love it if you could clarify that.
Just to clarify, we think that there's a big difference between celebrating the fact that World War II came to a close and celebrating Winston Churchill, a man who may have contributed to that effort, but also led to the systematic starvation of an entire continent of people. There's a huge distinction there. One glorifies an individual, one recognizes an event.
I understand. That's the problem, is that under your case, we really don't know whether or not we can celebrate Winston Churchill. Because you're telling us that Winston Churchill did something good and he did something bad. Here's the problem. Under your case, society doesn't know, can we celebrate him, because you flip-flopped in back-to-back layers of analysis in your first speech. This is extremely crucial. So moving on to the second substantive, which had to do with education. Their first layer of analysis was about less bias. This argument's interesting because it really doesn't have a link. That's my response, is that society isn't actually changed under Team Proposition. They say, these people did something wrong, we're not going to celebrate them. My question is, how do those two things link? How does pointing out that someone did something wrong and then actually changing the mindset of society link? And I'm going to be essentially talking about this additionally and expounding upon it under their second layer of analysis, which was that policies will actually change. Here's the idea for Team Proposition. Racists stay racist. In the current system, people who endorse racism, they know that most people disagree with them. Team Proposition just continues that, and they say, oh yeah, we disagree with you even more than we used to disagree with you. And the person who endorses racism says, okay, I still endorse this idea. Because they endorsed it from the very start, even when a vast majority of people still disagreed with them. The problem is that the positive impacts Team Proposition is claiming for society don't actually come about. Because the inherent problems that we see in society continue. they never actually make the link between saying this person did something bad and the actual change in policies. And until we see that link from side proposition, they can't claim any of those benefits that they've been advocating for. This brings me to the first constructive argument of side proposition,
Sir?
which has to do with the arbitrary standards that side proposition leaves on society. Now, the interesting thing here is that side proposition tells you we can't celebrate a person if they've done anything deeply immoral. The problem is that some people have had a few deeply immoral actions, but they actually weren't inherently bad people. Side opposition believes that people like Vladimir Lenin, who ordered the execution of 100,000 Russian citizens on the way to creating the Soviet Union, side opposition believes that he is a deeply immoral person who should not be celebrated. Side opposition also believes that Winston Churchill, who made mistakes, sure, who made deeply immoral mistakes, sure, is still a person who should be celebrated, not for the good things he did, for the good things he did, absolutely not for the bad things that he did. And we want to make it clear that there's a distinction there. That you can celebrate an action that a person did without saying everything that that person did was good. And that's the crucial argument on the side of team opposition. And that's what we're going to be advocating for throughout the rest of my speech. So I want to show you that essentially creating this artificial scale of how much good and how much bad a person can do is detrimental to society. Because side proposition tells you, well, if someone has ever done something deeply immoral, that means they can't be celebrated. And that's the problem, is that, again, society is left with those ideals instead of actual people who they can emulate and follow to end oppression and injustice. So team proposition doesn't actually fulfill their goal of ending oppression.
Last chance.
All they do is say, here's the issue, somebody did something bad, we're not going to celebrate them. And they don't actually end systemic injustice or oppression. The ultimate impact here is oppression of reasonability by side proposition. The reasonable thing to do in this instance is to take people who were awful people, like Vladimir Lenin, and not celebrate them. The reasonable thing to do, in addition to that, is take people who messed up, but who were also committing amazing actions in an attempt to help their country and to better society, like Winston Churchill, and to celebrate those people. That's the most reasonable thing to do. That's the thing that's going to benefit society. Side proposition leaves society with a little bit of a slippery slope. The resolution is worded very particularly. It asks us to consider figures involved in deeply immoral actions. The logical inference is clear. A person can commit an immoral action, but as a society, we have to distinguish between an immoral action and an immoral person. Condoning a person does not mean we condone every single one of their actions. And because that is our strongly held view on side opposition, we are so proud to oppose. Thank you very much for your time.
Speakers hold for 18 seconds.
I thank the speaker for his fine opening speech. Now I'd like to invite the second speaker of the proposition to explain us her remarks.
At the very top of my speech, I would like to make one thing exceedingly clear. There is a fundamental difference between making a mistake and deeply immoral actions. We believe that for people who are Native American, Andrew Jackson having this Trail of Tears scenario is more than just a slip-up. We would tell you that for people on the country of India, we believe that Winston Churchill actually creating more starvation is more than simply a small mistake that they would have you ignore, they would have you glorify, and they would have you celebrate. Rather, we would ask them to engage with the heart of the motion. We didn't hear any of that coming out of their first speech. In this speech, I'll be doing a couple of things. First, I'll be going over the material that they presented to us, and secondly, I'll be clarifying a few things on our side of the house, and also I'm responding to some of the arguments they made against our case, and finally I will be delivering our third substantive argument, which is about perpetuating oppression. But first, let's talk about a lot of the content that they delivered to us. Essentially, they gave us one big argument in the entirety of their speech. They make the assumption that some harms are simply mistakes, that simply the bad doesn't outweigh the good. Rather, what we would tell you is with the examples I gave you at the top of the speech, actually today's debate is about deeply immoral actions. Seeing as they themselves actually agree with our definitions, we would ask them to actually engage with us on what this motion should be about how it's about celebrations, it's about the idea of these characters who do have deeply immoral actions being celebrated, and insofar as these individuals are being celebrated, they are in fact glorified. Not just the actions they did that were good, but also whenever you celebrate a person, we believe you actually fundamentally celebrate all aspects of that individual, and that's what Ella tells you, that's what they have left to engage with. Seeing as that was their main argument, now I'm going to go on to answering a few points and having a little bit of clarification on our side of the house. So the second main assumption they make is they assume that we can't celebrate a single thing in our world. We find this very interesting. Rather, what we would tell you is there is a difference between celebrating that World War II came to an end and Winston Churchill led to the starvation of a country. We believe this is a distinction that they have to actually engage with and not simply pretend that we didn't say. Rather, we're saying that there is a large difference between messing up and a deeply immoral action. They don't tell us why we should be compelled to listen to their framing. Rather, what we believe is that Ella really presents this very clearly. She tells you that today's debate is supposed to be about celebration, it's supposed to be about deeply immoral actions. They don't engage with either level of this, that's why we already win the round. But the second main assumption they make is they assume that pointing out and ending celebration doesn't impact society. First off, we find this idea very problematic insofar as it does, and also what we tell you is the reason for this is because whenever the state is no longer celebrating these actors and is simply sending a message that these things were not okay, we believe that actually helps to actually impact the people. But more on that in our third argument. But secondly, what we tell you is at the very least, even if you don't buy any of the analysis that Ella already delivered to you, what we would say is that that racism is no longer combated at all, as they believe. Rather, what we tell you is that the government still has a fundamental obligation to actually help its people. So now on to a few clarifications. First off, once again, the debate is about actions that are deeply immoral, as Ella already explained, meaning objectively immoral actions such as genocide, murder, or rape that ought not to be celebrated, and they agree with this. But secondly, what do we present? We say that first, principally, let's extend the argument of symbolic action. What we tell you is that states have an obligation to protect the interests of their people. And oftentimes, if there was an individual that led to a massacre of a subset of those people, celebration violates this obligation. We would not ask a Native American child to skip school in honor of a man who actively led to the brutal death of 20 million of their ancestors. They have to defend this. They don't have to simply say that this was a mistake. Rather, what we tell you is that this is what the debate is about. This is what they haven't engaged with. But now let's talk about their next idea, but before I go on, I'll take a point.
Can we celebrate Winston Churchill, or can't we?
We cannot. I think we make that very, very clear. Okay, let's go on to our next point. We say that rather we can educate about both the positive and destructive actions of an individual that they did in the past, leaving room for more objectivity and less glorification. But next, let's go on to our final substantive argument, where we tell you about perpetuating oppression and how that increases radicalism. Our first layer of analysis is increasing radicalism. What does celebration lead to? It makes us think that what we are celebrating is worthy of being celebrated. On-side proposition, we fundamentally believe that immorality should not be celebrated because celebration sends a message that participating in immoral actions can be legitimized and excused in some way. Allowing society to not condone but to celebrate atrocious acts leads to various groups latching onto the ideas and advocating for them. This comes in direct conflict with their point about how it doesn't actually stimulate societal change. Take the example of the alt-right in the US. That's why we see radical groups forming like the alt-right groups in the US and France. They're fueled by state complacency that they would have you continue. But furthermore, take the example of Myanmar with Aung San Suu Kyi. We tell you that she is the face of Myanmar as state counselor, but has completely ignored the genocide of the Rohingya people in Myanmar. Rather, when the state legitimizes this behavior, they send a message to radical groups that radicalism is not only protected, but actively celebrated. We believe this is always morally abhorrent. But our second layer of analysis is setting a precedent for abuse in government. Politicians say what people want to hear in order to get elected. Every oppressive government today reveres oppressive historical figures. Take the example of Mao Zedong in China, or the Kim dynasty in North Korea, or the Castros in Cuba. State celebration sends a direct message to the people that the government is willing to overlook immoral actions and even praise those actions that were committed in the past. Because what we believe is that people under these governments adopt this mindset either through government indoctrination or through threat. Thus, politicians continue to perpetuate oppression linked to historical figures by praising them to garner votes and political capital. But I'll take your point.
Could you respond to the exact quotation from my speech, which read, "Condoning a person does not mean we condone every single one of their actions"?
We believe that whenever you celebrate a person, you celebrate everything they did. We don't believe that they isolate these things on their side of the house. Rather, what we tell you is that an objective mechanism they have to respond to and didn't do in their first speech is the mechanism of education. But rather, secondly, what we believe is there's tangible harms to this, going back to our argument. We believe that ending celebrations is key to breaking this cycle. Breaking the cycle and stopping the celebration of people and immoral principles that are behind these individuals. Condemning figures condemns the very principles of oppression. But our third layer of analysis is celebration commercializes deeply immoral actions. Celebration doesn't just mean the verbal praise that historical figures receive, but it also entails monetization of these events that shift focus from former and even glorify deeply immoral actions. Take the example of Columbus Day in America. Christopher Columbus doesn't just get his own holiday, he gets his own sales and discounts too. Someone who pillaged and massacred hundreds of thousands of Native Americans should not have any kind of celebration. This is the comparative they don't engage with. But secondly, take the example of Genghis Khan's birthday in Mongolia. We tell you that he has his own airport, and also there's actual schools and museums that are named after this individual. Insofar as that we believe that he was someone who perpetuated rape so much that now there are over 16 million people who are descendants of this individual, we believe they ought not to be celebrated. Rather, what we ask is that celebration results in commercializing historical figures and mass the atrocities they committed. Celebration corrupts the truth about what really happened and attracts a positive connotation to these individuals and the principles they stood behind for something we should be wholeheartedly denouncing. It is because we believe in this idea. They don't tell us why we shouldn't believe in this idea that we are so proud to propose today's motion.
The speaker talked for 8 minutes and 6 seconds.
I thank the speaker for her fine speech. Now I invite the second speaker to continue for the side opposition.
What Proposition has said today is that we cannot celebrate the deeply immoral actions of people. However, we can celebrate the good parts. The problem is that they fail to acknowledge the possibility of celebrating the good actions that those people take through the celebration of the individual. That is a legitimate possibility, and it's what happens most of the time. When we're celebrating a person, what we're celebrating is their good actions. The false assumption is that when we celebrate a person, we are therefore celebrating each and every action that person took. That's simply not true, and that is the stance of the opposition team in today's debate round. As a clarification, as team opposition, we are not saying that we should celebrate every single historical figure. That's absolutely not true. There are historical figures out there who should not be celebrated at all. Just as a clarification, we totally acknowledge that there are some that it would be wrong to celebrate. Now, to move on, in this second opposition speech, I'm going to be addressing each of the arguments brought up by Proposition in the last speech, then moving on and presenting the second made substantive argument from Team Opposition, that ending celebrations handicaps societal progress. But to start out with, one of the first arguments in the Proposition speech was that they said that as Team Opposition, what we were saying is that deeply immoral actions are just a mistake. That's a false characterization of our argument. We're not saying that, oh, that was a mistake that you went and raped someone. No, not at all. We're not claiming it's a mistake. We think those deeply immoral actions are really, really bad. We're not somehow brushing it off and saying that those historical figures were fine for doing it. Absolutely not. It was a really bad thing we did. However, what our argument is is that when we're celebrating those people, we do not want to celebrate the bad ones, but it would be great for society to focus on the good ones. We'll go through the benefits of that later on.
Points?
The next main argument they had was discussing how it's a symbolic action from the government. But the problem with that is that they just said it was symbolic and there's not really an impact. There needs to be an impact for this action to have a legitimate reason to be taken. The action must have an effect in order to claim that there's some great reason that the government should do it. They can't just say, this is a symbolic action, we should do it. They need to tell us why that would actually be a good thing. The next argument was, in a point of information, they were discussing how we cannot celebrate Winston Churchill, but we should celebrate the ending of World War II. Now the problem with this is that we're not changing the actual celebration. When we're celebrating Winston Churchill, what we're celebrating is the end of World War II. What Team Proposition is saying is that we can no longer call it the celebration of Winston Churchill, and yet the celebration and what we do, what we talk about, everything else stays exactly the same. It's just a surface level change that doesn't really have an impact. Now the next argument is discussing how we should educate about the positive stuff. The problem with this is that they don't recognize that this already exists in the current, how it works right now. When we're celebrating a person, we're focusing on their good actions and that's what we talk about. We're not saying that everything else they did was okay. The next argument they were talking about was discussing how celebration again, they were saying that proposition is saying that celebration means that we're celebrating every single action that that historical figure took. However, again, that's simply not true. That is not how it works. When we celebrate an individual, it does not mean that we say all of their actions were okay. Talking about that point, they were discussing how this celebration commercializes the deeply immoral actions. Underneath this point, they were discussing the example of Columbus Day. Now, the response to this is that the celebration of Columbus Day is not about rape and the horrible things that Columbus did. That's absolutely not true. When we celebrate Columbus Day, what we're talking about, what we're celebrating, what the conversation is about, and the reason for the holiday is discussing the discovery. What came from that? How America was able to progress as a society. We are not talking about all the great things, all the horrible things that Columbus did. That's simply not true. What we're talking about, what the true celebration is about discovery. Again, it doesn't really change under the proposition team. Yes, go ahead.
It's exactly this idea of only focusing on discovery that leads to a lot of people in America completely forgetting what Columbus really did, massacring millions of Native American populations. That's the comparative, that's what you have to defend.
Yes, it's absolutely horrible if we forget about Columbus doing that. That's why when we learn about Columbus in the history books, we do a deep examination of his entire life.
Exactly.
We go through all the horrible things that he did. But when we're celebrating the discovery of America, we're focusing on the good parts. The celebration does not mean that we're okay with everything else he did. So now that I've addressed each of the arguments, let's move on to the second substantive, how ending celebrations handicap societal progress. I already went through this a bit earlier, but discussing how just changing the name of the celebration doesn't really have a big impact. Essentially, what they're doing is just a feel-good policy. It's something that makes us feel like we're doing something better, but they fail to recognize that there's no real impact to that minor change. In fact, this is not only an unproductive one, but it's something that's actually deeply damaging to society. This is for two main reasons, which I'll go into right now. The first is that it delegitimizes societal hurt. So essentially, when we follow through with this action, say Robert E. Lee, we remove the statue. Then what will happen is when we have this, we still have the problem of racism in America, when people bring it up and say, hey, there's a problem with racism, the response is now going to be, no, we already fixed it because we removed those statues. That is absolutely detrimental to society. Anything that's like this, a feel-good policy, is not something that we condone. When racial injustice is brought up, it will no longer be given as much weight as it does before because we have this policy that we feel like was a sacrifice. We feel like we're doing a good thing for racism in America, but we didn't actually fix the problem. It delegitimizes the societal hurt. The second main problem for society under this is how it removes motivation. Essentially what I'm talking about under this point is how it removes someone, the ideal, an example of someone that we want to work towards being. Historical figures are a significant source of motivation for today's reformers. To stop the celebration of a historical figure for one deeply immoral action condemns their entire legacy. So if we have Winston Churchill and we decide he did something very, very wrong, therefore we cannot celebrate any part of him. The problem is that we're no longer able to focus on the good things. We're no longer able to have people in society say, look at all the great things he did. I want to do those good actions like Winston Churchill did. We completely remove that because Winston Churchill is no longer someone that we can follow after at all. Another example is Nelson Mandela, who has been a great inspiration for reformers in today, specifically arguing for racial injustice. Well, the truth about Nelson Mandela is that earlier on in his life, he was a really bad guy who led to the death of many, many people through bombings, etc. The problem is that now we're not able to strive to be like Nelson Mandela and solve those racial injustices because we condemned his entire legacy. We're no longer able to look at the good parts because we decided he did some really bad things early, therefore we have to ignore all the good things he did later on. What we see through this is that when we lose historical figures to emulate, we're losing societal progress. People are no longer able to strive to be like someone in the past. Instead, they have to strive to be an imaginary character.
The speaker called for 8 minutes and 19 seconds.
Okay, I thank the second speaker of the opposition and I'd like to invite the third speaker to continue to cite the proposition.
I find this idea rather funny that they're going to come up here and they're going to say that we need to put up Confederate statues and leave them there so we can have discussions about racism in the United States. Have you seen our president? I think we know that racism exists. In this speech, I'm going to be going over a couple of things. Mainly 3 questions that we must be asking ourselves while weighing today's round. First, we have to talk about who upholds the principle of this debate. Second, we have to talk about what is the best way to increase this discourse. And third, we have to look at what are the negative harms of this celebration. But before I get into those 3 questions, we have a couple of things that we need to further address. Let's go back to this complacency point that they bring up in their 3rd substantive. A couple of responses to this. First, we believe that it's ultimately going to be hurting all of these African Americans when we are celebrating those oppressors. We've brought you examples before of how we think it's morally wrong to have these children who are Native American have an entire day off of school in order to celebrate their oppressors. Very similarly, we don't believe that these African American children should be walking through their schools looking at pictures of plastered all over the walls of those who abused and oppressed their ancestors. That is morally wrong. But second, we believe that this actually perpetuates oppression. What we see is this has the rallying effect. Not only do we see this in the United States, but we also see it in other places around the world. Look to Russia, for example, where you see that Stalin, one of the most abusive people within Russia's history, is also the most celebrated political figure in Russia's history. People rally around the different ideas that he brought forth to society. This ultimately perpetuates oppression. It doesn't solve it. But third, we ultimately see that this is only having negative effects on society as a whole. The second thing that we need to make very, very clear is this idea of celebration that they keep bringing up. When you celebrate something, you recognize the good stuff and you can ignore and condone the bad stuff. They even come up here and they say, well, obviously, when we're celebrating something, we're not celebrating the bad stuff that they do. But here's the problem with that. When you're celebrating an individual, you are celebrating everything that they stand for. This means you're legitimizing the negative actions that they took against other people, and this means that you are glossing over all of the negative harms that those different actions had on society. This is wrong. We need to take a stand on that, and that is the main reason why you should vote for the proposition. A couple of other things we need to address.
Then we have to address this idea of education. We believe that you can recognize the good aspects of, you can recognize the good aspects of what an individual did, but you don't have to celebrate it. And this really brings me to my main problem that I have with the opposition throughout this debate. They never specifically talk about why celebration is, 1, necessary, and 2, good. Hold them to that standard, make them do that, because they have yet to talk about the unique benefits of celebration, and that is literally their job. Let's move on. So, we also, before I move on to the first question, would like to point out one contradiction that they had. Originally, when they walked up here, they were taking the stance that all of these people are making mistakes. And these mistakes are not something that we should condone. Their second speaker comes up here, and she immediately begins to backpedal and say, oh no, we realize that a lot of these actions are deeply immoral. Those aren't the people that we're celebrating. So we would like for them to choose the stance and stick to it. Let's move on to the first point on that, which is who ultimately upholds the principle of this debate. But before I move on, go.
That's not a contradiction. The mistake is that they did something deeply immoral. We're simply saying that we should celebrate the good things that they did.
Okay, well the way you phrased it the first time is like, oh, this is just this little thing that we should let go. And the second time you're like, oh, this is horrible, like it affected millions of people. So we believe we still shouldn't stand behind these people that had negative impacts that affected millions of people. Either way, if you're defining mistake as a deeply immoral action, we don't stand behind that. We don't celebrate it. Let's move on. First question, who upholds the principle of this debate? Now, the only principle that they really bring us is this idea that we don't deserve to be condemning these people based off of one action. And we tell you that the government and society must take a stand against these actions, even if that action was just one action. If that action had deeply immoral impacts on a set of society, we must do something, we must take a stand. It's the principle of the matter. They tell you that racism is going to happen no matter what you do. So we might as well, just keep building these statues, keep letting all of this happen, because that's what's going to fix it. No, what's going to fix it is when society sees that we are taking a stand that we should not celebrate these people. When we make that point that we are no longer going to condone these actions, that's what's going to be starting this discourse. That's what's ultimately going to get people to stop perpetuating this idea that oppression is okay. Let's move on to the second question, which is what is the best way to increase discourse? Now, this is something that I would like to make very clear. We don't need celebration in order to have discourse. In fact, they even talk about it themselves, how beneficial education can be when it comes to certain things, about deeply analyzing both the negative impacts that an individual can have on society and the benefits that an individual brings to society. In fact, I literally, within the last month, have learned a ton about Nelson Mandela in one of my history classes. This didn't require me to celebrate this individual. This just required me to listen to my teacher and deeply analyze how he ended apartheid and the actions that he ended up having to take to get there, whether or not those were immoral. That's what you ultimately see happens when you look to education. You can point out the negative consequences that ended up happening through this process while also recognizing the benefits that this individual had. It doesn't require a rally. Let's move on to the third question, which are what are the negative harms of this celebration? Now, we don't really have anything to compare it to because I'd love to do a comparison about the benefits of celebration and the harms of celebration, but we haven't heard any of the benefits of celebration, so I guess I'll just talk about the harms. We see that it glosses over these individual harms that we're seeing to society as a whole. When an individual works through some sort of a process, whether that requires violent actions, whether that requires any sort of an action that's going to be negatively harming society, if you celebrate this individual, you don't pay attention to the bad things. They've actually even brought this up in their second speech. And it's because we don't think you should be able to just gloss over these harms that we are proud to stand in firm proposition of this. When you celebrate this individual, that's what's ultimately only focusing on the good that this person does. Whereas this really should be something where you're looking at both sides of it. You should have some sort of a mechanism to do a multi-dimensional sort of analysis on this. And the only way that that is done is if you don't celebrate these individuals. Look to Pol Pot, for example. He was a brutal dictator that killed millions of minorities in Cambodia. Look to Stalin, who starved his people. Look to Christopher Columbus, who killed Native Americans. All of these people have harms. All of these people are celebrated, and through that celebration, we ignore the bad that they did. We, on Side Proposition, are proud to take a stand against these sort of actions. We are proud to stand up for those who are oppressed, who don't don't have their voices heard because we are glossing over the fact that there were negative harms committed to their minority. We are proud to ultimately take that stance and say that we are no longer going to condone these actions that these people committed. And it's because of this I'm so proud to propose.
The speaker talked for 7 minutes and 55 seconds.
Thank you, Speaker, and now I invite the last constructive speaker in this debate to continue for side opposition.
The proposition team has continually made this stance, that not a single historical figure who has ever committed a deeply immoral action should for any reason ever be celebrated, and that's the standard we are holding them to in today's debate round. What I want to show you is going over the 3 clash points that we have discussed in today's round, showing you how the burden they put on themselves has not yet been fulfilled. The first clash point we'll talk about is whether or not celebration of a person means you celebrate all the actions that they committed. The second clash point is will society agree with the bad actions, and going over the idea of government morality, whether they have to address those. And third clash point is whether or not celebration is necessary. Let's get into the first idea about whether or not celebration of a person essentially celebrates all of their actions. And what the proposition team has told you without any analysis is yes, that if you celebrate a person, what you are saying is that every action they took was okay. And that is completely false, because in the real world, no one does this. When you celebrate somebody, you do not say, I celebrate literally everything you ever did. You celebrate the good aspects of that person. We'll address the effects of society about that later, but let's understand why this is the case. Again, with this question, it's not a debate about whether or not they committed deeply immoral actions. It essentially makes no sense to say that celebration is about their harms rather than their benefits. When we put up statues, when we have people about Columbus Day specifically as an example, we celebrate the good things that they did, not every action that they ever took. Celebration, whether it's about deeply immoral actions or something simple, is the same across the board. This is important to understand when we look again at the real world. Let's look at the example of a happy birthday. It is a very common term and a very good idea of a celebration. When you tell someone happy birthday, are you saying, I am happy birthday you because of everything you have done in your entire life, or are you saying, I am glad that you are here and doing good things for the world? It is obviously the second answer. In the real world, this makes zero logical sense, and they have had no analysis to say otherwise. Let's move on to the second clash point, which deals with whether or not society will agree with these bad actions. The proposition team has constantly told you this, that when society celebrates these people and they celebrate their bad actions, they will suddenly start agreeing with them. They've also said that once we remove those actions or remove the statues, for example, like of Robert E. Lee, people will suddenly start agreeing and stop being racist. I want to address all of these ideas under this clash point. Now, what we have to understand is that society is not blinded. They've made an assumption that if you celebrate the good actions of someone like Nelson Mandela, then history books ignore the bad actions that he did, and that is completely and totally false. Countries are not celebrating the good actions and hiding the bad ones from their people. That doesn't happen. There was a way to access and find out if they were a completely moral person or if they committed deeply immoral actions. This is important to understand, because when we celebrate a person, we are not telling society that this is all you're allowed to know and all you're allowed to celebrate. We do that to let society know collectively the actions this person took were good. Not this person was inherently moral, not this person was inherently perfect, but the things he did benefited society. We'll want to look later at the issue of Nelson Mandela because it's a very good example of someone who committed a serious, deeply immoral action and yet also did some very good things that benefited the entire world. Before I get to that example, we have to understand that people are essentially positively and negatively effective on society, at least on the issue of deeply immoral actions. Let's go to the idea of Nelson Mandela, because what he did is he did do some bad things. Before he went to prison for 20 to 30 years, he had bombed people and committed very deeply immoral actions. But if we look at what happened after, he essentially became the greatest influence on promoting social justice in the entire world. What the proposition team would tell you is that we should hurt the people, or the idea, those groups of people that were bombed by him and their relatives, and that we should save them, and also hurt every single person who was supported, promoted, or inspired by the good actions that Nelson Mandela did. And this is the flaw in the proposition's case, is they assume that if you stop celebrating the good actions, then that ultimately means no one is hurt, which is false.
So, sir,
people are inspired, I'll get you in a second, people are inspired, people promote the things like Nelson Mandela and what they did. When you stop those celebrations, what you do is no longer allow that in society, and you demote the good actions they did, you demote the inspiration that he gives. Yes?
you continue to talk about this idea of morality. So do you think it's immoral to let a Native American child to force them to skip school in honor of a man who killed 20 million of their ancestors?
There are two misconceptions with this question. The first is assuming that when we celebrate the person they were addressing, we're celebrating the killing of 20 million people, which is absolutely false. The second problem with this is they're assuming that just because you benefit those people, it means no one else is hurt. It completely ignores everything that I just said. It completely ignores the fact that if we stop celebrating Nelson Mandela, even if you benefit people, you also hurt every single person he has ever inspired. You hurt every single relative of a person who was affected by the actions that he took, and they cannot say that is a good thing. This is important when we get to the third flashpoint, which is dealing with the idea of whether or not celebration is necessary or whether or not it is beneficial. And the answer to this is an absolute yes. Now, without the celebration of good actions, what you do is the exact opposite of what they claim. Essentially, what they say is right now, when we celebrate people, we celebrate their bad actions as well. Now, the problem with this is that when you ignore or condemn someone because of those bad actions, you ignore and condemn all the actions they took. If it were true for them to say that this was not the case, they would be contradicting everything they said in this entire debate round, which is that when you celebrate someone, you celebrate all of their actions. The same goes for the opposite. When you condemn someone, you condemn all of their actions. That is the logic that they are giving you, and I'm telling you that logic is flawed. That we do not celebrate people 100% and completely. We celebrate their benefits to society, and they would have you take that away because of a few bad actions. I do not want to say those actions were not harmful. I do not want to say we should ignore them. I want to say that the celebration of the good ones is something that is necessary and beneficial to society. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about is essentially the idea of proposition saying that if you remove these statues, it's going to help society, policies will be changed. I have a question for them. Specifically with Lenin, when 2,000 statues were removed a long time ago, how many people stopped becoming racist because of that action? My answer, absolutely no one. As my partner discussed, when you take down these statues, when you stop celebrating someone, the people who believe in racism, the people who believe in those deeply immoral actions, aren't just going to stop. That's not how it works. They didn't become a racist because we put up a statue of Robert E. Lee. That happened before the case ever occurred. Removing the statue has zero effect on the minds of those who agree with the deeply immoral actions. And this is important because there was no real benefit to society. There is no real mental change. There is no real physical change. There was only the hurt of the hearts and the minds of the people who are benefited by good societal change. The proposition team started with a burden, and not once in this entire debate round have they upheld it. Thank you.
The speaker talked for 18 sentences.
Okay, I thank the speaker for his fine speech. Now I'd like to invite the reply speakers to conclude this debate. First, the reply speaker for the opposition. Stage is yours.
The main issue in today's debate round is what celebration actually means. We've had a lot of argumentation back and forth throughout this entire round, and hopefully I'm going to give a general overview about what exactly went down. So in this speech, we'll go through a few of the main arguments in today's debate round, then briefly go over the clashes, and finally move on to the burdens, or who has proven what or who needs to prove what in today's debate round. So to start off with, let's look at the argument of how we must condemn the individuals who have committed deeply immoral actions. That's what proposition team said. They said why we have to do that is because celebration means, a celebration of an individual means that we're celebrating their entire person, every single action they took throughout their entire life. As opposition, we came back and said, no, we don't have to condemn every single action they took, we must condemn the immoral ones. But it's great for society if we can focus on the great effects that they had. Then we went through some of the benefits that that would have. Opposition came back and again restated that celebration means that we are condoning every single action that person took. Still, that's what their entire case is based on, that flawed mindset of what celebration actually means. I grew up celebrating Columbus Day, talking about discovery of America, the development of America, on and on. I personally am not very confused about whether or not rape is okay. That's not what the celebration was really about. That's what we learned in our history books. When we're celebrating Columbus Day, we're celebrating his great actions and those effects. That's simply not true to say that that's what celebration means. That's what we're going to see basically every argument tying back to in the end of today's debate round. The next main argument was discussing how we will improve education. So they say that we must improve the education of society and make sure everybody knows that these bad actions are really not okay. Opposition, we agree with that second part. It is really important that we know that those bad actions are really not okay. However, we have an issue with how they got to that point. How they went from saying that those bad actions are really not okay, therefore we can't celebrate historical figures at all. Again, that goes back to their false definition of celebration. That's not what it actually means to celebrate somebody. They went on to say that people will think that these deeply immoral actions are okay. Again, that's not true. When we're celebrating, what we're talking about, what the discussion is about, what is being celebrated is the good actions. When we're celebrating, we're not even talking about the bad actions because that's not the focus right then. When we do talk about those bad actions, it's when we're talking about history and we're actually learning what really happened. It's not during the celebration, it's when we're learning about history. The final main argument was whether or not society is helped or harmed. Again, they went back to how we're normalizing immoral actions. However, we as opposition believe that is not true. We believe that it is extremely important to have these historical ideals to strive to be like. And that when we are focused on those good actions, it's great to have people that we can focus on the good actions. We want to strive to be like people in the past who had great actions. The three clashes brought up by team opposition was first that of celebration, that society will agree, and that celebration is necessary. My partner already explained them in the last speech, so I'll go ahead and move on to the burdens. The burden that we as opposition need to prove is that we're not really harming society by the celebration of these immoral figures. We need to show you that we can show you at least one historical figure who committed a deeply immoral action and yet still should be celebrated. Because as a proposition must prove that it's actually detrimental to society to do that. I already went through all the argumentations proving this or not, but what we went through was the main definition of celebration. When we're celebrating somebody, we are absolutely not condoning all of their immoral actions. The celebration is focused on the good part. It is simply false to claim that when we're celebrating somebody, we are saying that those deeply immoral actions they took are normal and good and should be accepted. That is absolutely the false claim by a team proposition in today's round. Thank you.
The speaker called for 4 minutes.
I thank the last speaker for the opposition, and I would like to invite the last speaker of the proposition to conclude this debate. Stage is yours.
Last time I checked, statues of Confederate General Robert E. Lee don't have asterisks on them saying, "Disclaimer, this individual promoted a policy that led to the death and subjugation of millions." The same thing is true of statues of Nelson Mandela, whose actions led to the death of more than 130 individuals, something that I actually didn't know until I was researching this topic. When proposition says that celebration only celebrates the positive, they were absolutely right. But what it does in doing that is it ignores and condones all of the negative things that an individual did, which is precisely why 40% of British citizens think that colonialism was something to be proud of. On the contrary, education ensures that we don't completely ignore all the negative actions that an individual did. We analyze both the positive and the negative. We don't glorify and celebrate an individual, and they fail to explain consistently why celebration is still justified given this. We think we promote healthier discourse and a much better world. 2 questions in this speech. First on the principle and second on the practical. Let's start with the principle. They are way behind on this issue. It seems they have pretty much one principal idea on how condemning good people who did immoral things is really, really wrong. And the analysis that they brought up, they cleared up in a POI. They said that when we mean that these individuals make mistakes, we mean that the mistakes are the deeply immoral actions. Okay, so when Winston Churchill causes a famine that kills millions of Indians, we're just supposed to throw up our hands and say, oops? We don't think that that is the case. We think that these deeply immoral actions go far beyond mistakes, and it is the government's principal obligation not to condone these behaviors that led to massive, massive oppression. Their only response to this was that, well, celebration doesn't celebrate everything an individual did. We think we cleared up what we mean by this. We simply condone the negative actions that they did. And they also say that this doesn't matter because it doesn't lead to any practical change. The point of a principled argument is that it is not contingent on practical change. You can vote for the proposition, hands down, simply on the issue that it is principally wrong for a government to condone these actions, independent of any practical outcome like decreasing racism. But we do think that the practical arguments were important in today's round, despite the fact that we win on face based on that principle. Let's talk about their argument about how we delegitimize the hurt of individuals when we refuse to celebrate historically controversial figures. We think that, first of all, generally the oppression, things like racism, with a celebration of generals like Robert E. Lee is pretty apparent. We also think that when we celebrate these individuals, we do not actually lead to healthy discourse around this issue, but rather toxic battles between alt-right rallying groups and people who don't like alt-right rallying groups. And the discourse there isn't particularly healthy. It's more divisive and hateful, whereas with education, it's much more productive. But even if you do think that awareness about these issues is going to decrease on our side of the House, we think it's really interesting that their mechanism for legitimizing the hurt of these individuals is to compound it. They want to legitimize the hurt of Native Americans by forcing Native American children to celebrate a man that brutally slaughtered 20 million of their ancestors. Legitimize the hurt of people whose ancestors were murdered by Joseph Stalin by reminding them of that every single day when they walk past statues of that individual. I'm sorry, but we cannot stand for that on-side proposition, and I deeply apologize if we hurt anyone who is inspired by Joseph Stalin in the process, but we don't think that that is in any way principally or practically supportable. On the other side, if we promote education, we promote healthy discourse about the bad things that these individuals did, it sets a healthy precedent that we will not stand for brutally immoral actions, we won't stand for genocide, no matter what a good person you were, and furthermore, I think that changes societal mindsets about these issues and promotes understanding. So on a principle and a practical level, mind you, this was something they really didn't engage with, the proposition takes today's debate. Thank you.
Thank the speaker for her fine speech. I thank the debaters for a fine, quality, engaging debate. I cannot avoid one comment. I can totally imagine Americans putting a disclaimer on a statue, keep in mind Columbus is a genocide. However, this is the only comment you get today. I will find you later, so we set a time, because I do have very constructive feedback for both of you, and also I will explain my decision after the break announcements. We will set a time and date later. I thank you for the debate. I now ask everybody to leave. You can go downstairs to the assembly room. I only ask my week and chair judge to stay in the room so we can fulfill the ballots. Thank you very much and good luck in the last round.